He thought humiliating her would be easy, just another quick case to move through his courtroom. But what he didn't realize was that Alicia Brooks wasn't there to defend herself. She was there to expose something he never expected anyone to see. And by the time he understood that, it would already be too late. The courtroom that morning felt like every other high-profile hearing Judge Harold Whitman had presided over. Polished oak benches lined with observers, the American flag standing motionless behind him, sunlight cutting through tall windows and reflecting across the marble floor. Everything about the room reinforced authority, control, order, and in the center of it all stood Alicia Brooks, a black woman in her late 30s, her clothes simple, her posture quiet but steady, the kind of presence people overlooked without a second thought, especially in a place like this, where appearances were silently ranked before a single word was spoken. Whispers moved quickly across the room as she stepped forward, some curious, most dismissive, a few openly amused. And when the clerk read out her name and the minor violation she'd been summoned for, a low ripple of laughter spread across the benches, subtle at first, then growing, encouraged by the absence of any correction, because Judge Whitman didn't stop it. He simply watched, his expression composed, detached, as if this moment confirmed exactly what he had already assumed about her. Another small case, another forgettable face, another person who didn't belong in a room governed by power and precision. Alicia lowered her eyes briefly, not in submission, but in focus, her fingers tightening slightly around the thin folder she carried, the paper edges perfectly aligned as if they mattered more than the opinions forming around her. The prosecutor stepped forward with a confident stride, voice sharp, polished, practiced, outlining the case in a tone that suggested inevitability, emphasizing her background, her occupation, each word carefully chosen to reduce her presence into something smaller, something easier to dismiss. And the courtroom responded exactly as expected, a few smirks, a few exchanged glances, the quiet satisfaction of people certain they understood the outcome before it even began. Judge Whitman leaned forward slightly, resting one hand near the gavel, his voice calm but edged with impatience as he addressed Alicia, urging her to respond, to acknowledge the claim, to move things along. But Alicia didn't rush, she didn't stumble, she simply lifted her head, her eyes steady now, no longer avoiding the room. And in that small shift, something changed, almost imperceptible, like the air tightening before a storm no one had forecast. She adjusted the folder in her hands, the movement precise, controlled, deliberate in a way that didn't match the role they had already assigned to her. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear, carrying farther than anyone expected. "Your Honor, may I ask one question?" And for the first time that morning, the rhythm of the courtroom broke, just slightly, just enough for doubt to slip in where certainty had been. The question lingered in the air longer than anyone expected, not because of its complexity, but because of the way Alicia Brooks asked it, calm and precise, as if she already knew the answer and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. Judge Harold Whitman's fingers paused just above the gavel, a subtle hesitation that would have gone unnoticed on any other day, but in that moment it felt louder than the earlier laughter. His eyes narrowed slightly, measuring her now, reassessing the woman he had already placed in a category he thought he understood, and for the first time, he did not respond immediately. "Proceed," he said finally, his voice controlled, but lacking the effortless authority it carried just moments ago. Alicia took a small step forward, placing her folder on the table with deliberate care, aligning it with the edge as if every movement mattered, as if precision itself was part of what she was about to reveal. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, sensing something changing but unable to define it. Alicia opened the folder slowly, not rushing, not reacting to the eyes fixed on her, and when she spoke again, her tone remained even. "Your Honor, before I respond to the allegation, I would like clarification on the filing date listed in this case." A simple question, almost procedural, but the way she asked it carried weight, the kind that made people listen whether they wanted to or not. The prosecutor quickly interjected, dismissive. "The filing date is already in the record," he said, attempting to regain control, but Alicia did not look at him. Her focus remained on the judge, unwavering. "Yes, it is," she replied softly. And that is exactly why I am asking. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quieter this time, uncertain, as if the audience was no longer sure whether they were witnessing something trivial or something they had misunderstood entirely. Judge Whitman leaned forward, glancing briefly at the document in front of him, then back at Alicia. "The date stands as recorded," he stated. But there was a flicker of doubt beneath his certainty now. Alicia nodded once, acknowledging the response, then gently turned one page within her folder and slid a single document forward, the paper catching the light as it moved across the table. "Then, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "could you explain why this official notice was issued after that date?" The room shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for the silence to feel different, heavier. The prosecutor stepped forward again, sharper this time. "That document has not been entered into evidence," he said quickly, but his voice carried less confidence than before. Alicia finally turned her gaze toward him, not confrontational, but clear. "It was sent to me directly by the court office," she replied, "with a timestamp that contradicts the filing you just confirmed." The words settled slowly, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place one by one. Judge Whitman's expression tightened, his hand lowering fully to the bench, no longer hovering near the gavel, as if even he understood that striking it now would not restore control. Alicia did not raise her voice. She did not push. She simply stood there, allowing the silence to expand around the implication she had just placed in the center of the room. And for the first time since the hearing began, no one laughed, no one whispered, because somewhere between that first question and the document now resting under the judge's gaze, the narrative had shifted, and everyone in that courtroom could feel it, even if they could not yet explain why. The silence did not break this time. It deepened, settling into the corners of the courtroom like something alive, something watching. As Judge Harold Whitman lowered his gaze back to the document Alicia Brooks had placed before him, his fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the paper as if grounding himself in something tangible, something certain, but certainty was no longer on his side. The timestamp was clear, precise down to the minute, and it did not match the official record he had just confirmed moments earlier, a discrepancy too exact to dismiss as a simple clerical error. The prosecutor shifted again, this time less controlled, stepping closer to the bench, his voice lowered but urgent, attempting to redirect the focus. "Your Honor, this line of questioning is irrelevant to the violation at hand." But the words landed weakly, lacking the authority they once carried, because even he could feel the shift, the subtle but undeniable change in the room's alignment. Alicia did not interrupt. She did not press. She simply stood with her hands resting lightly on the table, her posture composed, her breathing steady, allowing the weight of the evidence to speak before she ever needed to. Judge Whitman finally looked up, his expression no longer detached, no longer indifferent. There was calculation there now, careful, deliberate, as if he were searching for a path back to control. "Miss Brooks," he began, choosing his words more slowly than before. "Documentation can sometimes reflect administrative timing differences." But even as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction, and Alicia answered without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor, that can happen," her tone respectful, measured. "But administrative timing differences do not usually exceed 48 hours after a case has already been formally recorded." A faint ripple moved through the room, not laughter, not whispers, but awareness, people leaning forward, paying attention now, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Alicia reached into her folder again and withdrew another sheet, placing it beside the first, aligning them carefully so both were visible. "This is the confirmation notice I received from the court office," she continued. "And this is the public record entry you referenced." Her finger moved lightly between the two timestamps, not accusing, not aggressive, simply pointing. "They do not align." The simplicity of the statement made it harder to ignore, harder to dismiss. The prosecutor opened his mouth as if to object again, then stopped, his gaze flicking between the documents and the judge, uncertainty replacing the earlier confidence that had filled his stance. Judge Whitman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the lines around his eyes sharpening as he studied the papers again, longer this time. The courtroom remained completely still, no shifting, no murmurs. Even the usual background sounds seemed to have disappeared, as if the entire space was holding its breath. Alicia did not look around. She did not acknowledge the audience. Her focus remained fixed on the bench, unwavering, patient, as if she understood that the truth did not need urgency. It only needed space. And in that space, something began to surface, something that had been hidden beneath routine, beneath assumption, beneath the quiet confidence of authority. Judge Whitman finally set the document down, slower than before, his hand lingering for a fraction of a second before pulling away. And when he spoke again, the tone had changed, not drastically, but enough that anyone listening closely could hear it. "Where did you say you obtained this notice?" he asked. And it was not a challenge, not entirely. It was a question that carried something new, something unfamiliar to that courtroom: doubt. Alicia met his gaze without hesitation, her voice steady, clear, "From your court office, Your Honor," she said. And then, after the briefest pause, she added, "Signed and processed under your authorization." The words settled into the room with a quiet finality that no one could ignore. Signed and processed under your authorization, and for the first time since the hearing began, Judge Harold Whitman did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on Alicia Brooks, but it was no longer the look of a man in control. It was the look of someone recalculating, someone forced to consider that the situation before him was no longer predictable. The prosecutor cleared his throat, attempting to recover ground that had already begun to slip away. "Your Honor, there must be some procedural misunderstanding," he said, his voice carefully measured but no longer sharp, no longer certain. Alicia did not turn toward him. She did not engage with the interruption. Her focus remained steady on the bench, allowing the silence to press against the edges of the courtroom, stretching longer than anyone was comfortable with. The kind of silence that demands resolution, not noise. Judge Whitman finally shifted in his seat, the subtle movement drawing every eye back to him. His hand moved toward the document again, lifting it this time, holding it just slightly higher as if distance might change what was written there. But the timestamp remained the same, unchanged, undeniable. The second document lay beside it, aligned with almost deliberate precision, the contrast between them too exact to overlook. Alicia spoke again, her voice even, controlled, but now carrying a quiet authority that had not been there when she first entered the room. "Your Honor, I received that notice at 9:42 a.m. on a Tuesday," she said, her tone calm, factual. The official record shows the case was entered at 11:15 a.m. on the same day. She paused just long enough for the numbers to register, for the difference to become clear. That is not an administrative delay. That is a sequence that does not follow standard procedure. A faint shift moved through the observers, not laughter, not whispers, but recognition. The realization that something deeper than a minor violation was now being questioned. The prosecutor stepped forward again, more cautiously. "This time, even if there is a discrepancy, it does not change the nature of the violation," he insisted. But the words felt smaller now, less convincing. Alicia finally turned her gaze toward him, not confrontational, not raised, but direct. "It changes whether the process itself was valid," she replied, and the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than any argument. Judge Whitman exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that seemed to carry more than just the moment. His eyes moved between the documents once more, then back to Alicia, and something in his expression had shifted again, not fully, not openly, but enough to signal that the ground beneath the case was no longer stable. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate, "are you suggesting that this court issued documentation prior to the official filing of your case?" It was phrased as a question, but it carried the weight of an accusation, not toward her, but toward the implication itself. Alicia did not hesitate. "I am stating that the documentation exists," she answered, her voice steady, "and that it was generated within your system before the case was formally recorded." The distinction mattered, and she knew it. She was not attacking, she was revealing, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to deflect. The courtroom remained completely still, every person present now aware that they were no longer watching a routine hearing, but something unfolding that should not have been possible. Judge Whitman's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the bench before releasing a small movement, but one that spoke louder than any words he had yet to say, because control in that room had always been invisible, assumed, unquestioned, and now, for the first time, it was being examined, piece by piece, by someone they had all dismissed just minutes earlier, and the realization of that shift hung heavily in the air, impossible to ignore. The weight of her words did not fade. It expanded, pressing into every corner of the courtroom until even the smallest movement felt amplified. Judge Harold Whitman remained still for a moment longer than usual, and in that stillness something subtle but undeniable shifted, not in Alicia Brooks, but in the room itself, because the certainty that had filled it earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet, growing unease. The prosecutor adjusted his stance again, but this time there was hesitation in the movement, a carefulness that had not been there before. "Your Honor," he began, attempting to reclaim control, "we are moving away from the matter at hand." But even he seemed aware that the matter at hand had already changed. Alicia did not respond to him. She did not need to. Her position was no longer defensive, it was grounded, anchored in something the room could not easily dismiss. Judge Whitman finally leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her, not as a minor defendant, but as someone who had introduced a complication he could not immediately resolve. "Miss Brooks," he said slowly, "you are implying a procedural irregularity." The phrasing was deliberate, careful, as if redefining the situation might contain it. Alicia shook her head gently, not in disagreement, but in clarification. "I am not implying anything, Your Honor," she said, her voice calm, unwavering. "I am presenting a sequence that does not align with standard court procedure." The distinction settled heavily, and for the first time, the judge did not interrupt her. He listened. Alicia reached into her folder again, her movements precise, measured, and withdrew a third document, placing it beside the others, aligning all three into a clear sequence, each page catching the overhead light, forming a timeline that could not be ignored. "This is the intake confirmation from the clerk's office," she continued, her finger resting lightly on the page. "It is stamped at 9:38 a.m. For minutes before the notice I received." She shifted her hand slightly to the second document. "This is the notice itself, issued at 9:42 a.m., then to the third. And this is the official case entry, recorded at 11:15 a.m. She did not raise her voice. She did not rush the explanation. She allowed each time to settle, each detail to land. The courtroom followed the sequence almost involuntarily, eyes moving from one page to the next, connecting what had not been connected before. The prosecutor opened his mouth again, but no words came immediately. The clarity of the timeline left little room for interruption. Judge Whitman's gaze moved slowly across the documents, his expression tightening, not in anger, but in recognition, the kind that comes when a controlled system reveals something it was never meant to show. Alicia stepped back slightly, not retreating, but giving the evidence space to exist without her, as if she understood that the moment no longer required persuasion, only acknowledgement. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer uncertain. It was heavy with realization, because what had begun as a simple case had now exposed something deeper, something structural, something that could not be dismissed with a single ruling. Judge Whitman's hand moved again, but this time it did not reach for the gavel. It rested flat against the bench, steady, deliberate, as if anchoring himself against the shift unfolding before him. "Miss Brooks," he said finally, his voice lower, more measured than at any point before, "are you suggesting that your case was processed before it officially existed?" And this time, the question did not carry authority. It carried consequence. Alicia met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, her voice calm. "I am saying the system shows that it was," she replied, and in that moment, the courtroom understood something none of them had expected when they first began to laugh. This was no longer about her, and it had not been for some time. The realization did not explode. It unfolded slowly, like something long buried rising to the surface piece by piece. And as Alicia Brooks stood quietly beside the table, no longer explaining, no longer pushing, the courtroom began to understand that the evidence was no longer hers to defend. It was theirs to reconcile. Judge Harold Whitman's eyes lingered on the sequence of documents, his usual rhythm gone, replaced by a careful stillness that signaled something deeper than hesitation. It signaled awareness. The prosecutor shifted again, but this time he did not step forward. He remained where he was, as if uncertain whether moving would draw more attention to what was already unraveling. "Your Honor," he said, his voice lower now, less commanding. There could be an internal processing delay that is not reflected accurately in the system. But even as he spoke, the explanation felt incomplete, fragile against the precision of the timestamps laid out before them. Alicia did not respond immediately. She allowed the statement to settle, then gently shook her head, not dismissively, but with quiet certainty. "System delays do not generate official notices before intake confirmation," she said, her tone steady, factual, "and they do not assign authorization signatures before a case is entered into record." Her words did not rise in volume, but they carried farther than before, cutting through the remaining uncertainty like a clear line drawn across a blurred page. A faint sound echoed somewhere in the back of the room, a chair shifting, someone adjusting their posture, but no one spoke, no one interrupted, because what she was saying was no longer something that could be brushed aside. Judge Whitman leaned forward again, slower this time, his fingers interlocking briefly, before separating, a subtle sign of tension that would have gone unnoticed in any other setting. His gaze moved from the documents to Alicia, studying her not as a defendant, but as someone who had uncovered a flaw he had not anticipated. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice measured, each word placed carefully. "You seem to have a detailed understanding of procedural timing." It was not a question, but it invited one. Alicia met his gaze without hesitation, her expression composed, her voice unchanged. "I pay attention to systems that affect my livelihood, Your Honor," she replied, a simple statement, but one that carried layers the room was only beginning to recognize. She reached into her folder once more, her movements deliberate, controlled, and withdrew a final document, thinner than the others, but no less precise, placing it at the top of the sequence, slightly above the timeline she had already built. "This is the automated notification log from the court's public access system," she said, her finger resting lightly near the printed line. "It records when actions are generated internally, not when they are published externally." The distinction hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. Judge Whitman's eyes moved to the new document, scanning quickly at first, then more slowly, his expression tightening as the implication became clear. The timestamps aligned not with the official record, but with Alicia's earlier documents, forming a pattern that could not be ignored. The prosecutor's composure slipped for the first time, just slightly, his shoulders stiffening, his gaze shifting away from the bench, as if searching for something that was no longer there. Control. Alicia stepped back again, giving the document space, allowing the sequence to stand on its own, her role no longer to explain, but to reveal. And in that moment, the courtroom was no longer a place of assumption, it was a place of reckoning, because what had once been a simple case had now exposed a process that operated outside its own rules, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was absolute. The kind that arrives when everyone understands that the truth has already been spoken, and nothing said after can undo it. The silence no longer belonged to uncertainty, it belonged to consequence. And as Alicia Brooks stood still beside the table, her hands relaxed at her sides, the weight of everything she had placed before the court settled into a reality no one could ignore. Judge Harold Whitman did not move for several seconds, his eyes fixed on the final document, tracing the timestamps again as if repetition might produce a different answer. But it did not. The pattern remained, clear, consistent, undeniable. And for the first time in that courtroom, authority did not come from the bench, it came from the evidence laid out beneath it. The prosecutor shifted his weight, his earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious, more calculated, but even calculation required ground to stand on, and that ground was slipping. "Your Honor," he said, quieter now, "perhaps we should request a recess to review these materials more thoroughly." The suggestion lingered, an attempt to pause what could no longer be controlled. But Alicia spoke before the judge could respond, not interrupting, but entering the moment with precise timing. "A recess will not change the timestamps," she said calmly, her voice steady, respectful, yet firm, and the simplicity of that statement cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice could have. Judge Whitman slowly lifted his gaze from the documents to Alicia, and in that look there was no dismissal left, only recognition. Recognition that the situation had moved beyond routine procedure, beyond simple correction, into something that demanded acknowledgement. "Miss Brooks," he said, his tone measured, stripped of its earlier impatience, "why did you bring this forward today?" It was a different kind of question, not about the case, but about intent. Alicia did not hesitate. Her answer came without urgency, without emotion overpowering it. "Because it affects more than just me," she replied, and for a moment, that was all she said. Allowing the meaning to expand on its own, the courtroom remained still. Every person present aware that the scope of what they were witnessing had just widened. Alicia continued, her voice calm, deliberate. "If a notice can be generated before a case exists, then the process is not protecting the people it is supposed to serve." Her words were not accusatory. They were factual, grounded, and that made them harder to reject. The judge leaned back slightly, his hand no longer near the gavel, his posture no longer signaling immediate control, but careful consideration. The prosecutor glanced toward him, waiting for direction that did not come, because for the first time, there was no immediate path forward that would restore the original structure of the hearing. Alicia remained composed, her presence unchanged, but now the room saw her differently, not as a defendant, not as someone to be dismissed, but as the person who had revealed something none of them had anticipated. Judge Whitman exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but significant in its restraint. His eyes moved once more across the documents, then back to Alicia, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. "The court acknowledges that the documentation presented raises serious procedural concerns." The words were careful, deliberate, chosen with precision, but they marked a shift that could not be undone, a shift from assumption to recognition, from control to accountability. And as that acknowledgement settled into the room, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the realization that everything had changed, not because of force, not because of volume, but because one person had chosen to speak with clarity in a place that had expected her to remain quiet. The acknowledgement did not restore order. It transformed the space into something far more fragile, a courtroom no longer operating on assumption but on scrutiny. And as Alicia Brooks stood quietly, allowing the judge's words to settle, the shift became unmistakable. The authority that once filled the room now felt measured, careful, almost restrained. Judge Harold Whitman adjusted slightly in his seat, not to reassert control, but to reposition himself within a situation that had changed. Beyond routine procedure, his gaze moved once more across the documents, slower this time. As if each line demanded consideration rather than confirmation, the prosecutor remained still, his earlier momentum gone, replaced by a watchful silence, waiting for direction that did not come immediately, because there was no immediate path that could undo what had already been revealed. Alicia did not speak. She did not need to. Her role had shifted from participant to catalyst, and now the room was reacting to what she had uncovered rather than what she might say next. A faint sound echoed from the back, the soft movement of someone leaning forward, drawn into a moment that no longer felt ordinary. Judge Whitman finally placed both hands flat against the bench, steady, deliberate, a posture that signaled decision rather than reaction. "The court will need to review these discrepancies in full," he said, his voice controlled, but lacking the certainty it once carried, and determine whether the procedural sequence presented here reflects an error or a systemic issue. The distinction mattered, and the way he said it made that clear. Alicia lifted her gaze slightly, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement, her expression unchanged, her presence still. Composed, but now unmistakably grounded in the truth she had brought forward. The prosecutor shifted again, attempting to regain footing. "Your Honor, if this is a clerical matter, it can be addressed administratively without affecting the current proceeding." His tone careful, measured, but Alicia responded before the suggestion could take hold, her voice calm, but firm. "A clerical matter does not generate authorized notices ahead of record entry," she said, and the clarity of that statement left no room for reinterpretation. Judge Whitman did not interrupt her this time. He listened, and that alone marked a change no one in the room could ignore. Alicia took a slow breath, then continued, her tone steady, deliberate. If the system can act before it records, then decisions may be influenced before they are officially recognized. The implication settled heavily, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but precise, and precision made it impossible to dismiss. The judge's expression tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition of the weight carried by those words. His eyes moved briefly toward the clerk's station, then back to Alicia, as if considering not just the documents, but the process behind them, the unseen mechanisms that had operated unquestioned until now. The courtroom remained completely still, no one shifting, no one whispering, because everyone understood that the conversation had moved beyond a single case, beyond a single individual, into something broader, something structural. Alicia stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but allowing the moment to stand without her, as if she understood that the truth, once revealed, no longer required defense. Judge Whitman exhaled slowly, his voice lower when he spoke again. The court cannot proceed as if this information does not exist, he said, each word measured, deliberate. Further examination is required before any ruling can be made. And as that statement settled into the room, it became clear that the outcome had already begun to shift, not because of argument, not because of authority, but because the foundation beneath the case had been questioned, and once questioned, it could no longer be assumed. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, the kind that arrives when a system is forced to look at itself. And for the first time that day, every person in that courtroom knew they were witnessing something that would not simply end when the session adjourned. The shift could no longer be contained within the boundaries of a single hearing. It had expanded beyond the bench, beyond the documents, into the awareness of everyone present. And as Alicia Brooks remained still, her presence calm but unyielding, the courtroom itself seemed to recalibrate around what had been revealed. Judge Harold Whitman did not speak immediately after his last statement. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his posture no longer projecting control but consideration, his eyes moving once more across the sequence of timestamps as if searching for any detail that might restore the structure that had just been questioned. But there was none. The pattern held, consistent, precise, undeniable. The prosecutor glanced toward the clerk's desk, then back to the judge, as if waiting for an instruction that would re-establish order. But the absence of that instruction spoke louder than anything else, because it meant the usual process no longer applied. Alicia did not move. She did not speak. She allowed the silence to continue, understanding that this moment was no longer about persuasion. It was about recognition, a recognition that could not be rushed. Judge Whitman finally turned his attention toward the clerk, his voice measured, deliberate. "Retrieve the internal processing log for this case," he said, and the request itself carried weight, because it acknowledged that what Alicia had presented was not being dismissed, it was being verified. The clerk hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded and moved quickly, the soft sound of keys breaking the silence as the system was accessed. Every eye in the room shifted in that direction, drawn not by spectacle, but by the quiet gravity of what was about to be confirmed. The prosecutor straightened slightly, attempting to regain composure, but the tension in his posture remained, his earlier confidence now replaced by cautious observation. Alicia's gaze remained steady, not fixed on the clerk, not fixed on the judge, but forward, as if she had already reached the conclusion the room was just beginning to approach. The seconds stretched longer than expected, each one amplifying the weight of the moment, until the clerk's voice finally broke through, softer than usual, but unmistakably clear. "Your Honor, the internal log shows activity at 9:36 a.m. The number landed heavily. Earlier than even Alicia's first document, earlier than the intake confirmation, earlier than anything officially recorded. The courtroom did not react immediately. The meaning took a moment to settle, to connect with what had already been presented. Judge Whitman's expression tightened, his gaze shifting from the clerk back to the documents, then to Alicia, and in that sequence, something changed again, not in her, but in him. Because the evidence was no longer theoretical, it was confirmed. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, his eyes lowering briefly as if recalculating a position that no longer existed. Alicia did not speak. She did not need to. The truth had moved beyond her voice. It now existed independently, supported by the system itself. Judge Whitman's hand moved toward the bench, not to strike the gavel, but to steady himself, his voice quieter when he spoke. That predates both the intake and the official record, he said, and the acknowledgement carried more weight than any ruling could have in that moment. The courtroom remained completely still, the earlier laughter now impossible to imagine, replaced by a silence that held understanding, consequence, and something deeper, the realization that what had been uncovered was not an isolated detail, but a reflection of something that extended beyond a single case, beyond a single person. And as that realization settled into every corner of the room, it became clear that nothing about this proceeding would return to what it had been before. Alicia Brooks chose to ask one simple question. The confirmation did not create chaos. It created clarity, the kind that removes every remaining doubt and leaves only consequence behind. And as the clerk's words settled into the courtroom, Alicia Brooks remained exactly where she was, still, composed, her expression unchanged, because the moment no longer required reaction, it required recognition. Judge Harold Whitman did not look at the prosecutor this time. He did not look at the audience. His attention remained fixed on the documents and the internal log that had just been confirmed, his fingers resting lightly against the bench, no longer a symbol of authority, but of restraint, as if even he understood that any sudden action would feel out of place in a moment that demanded precision. Record that timestamp, he said quietly, and the clerk nodded immediately, the sound of typing returning, but softer now, more deliberate, as if the system itself was being handled with greater care. The prosecutor finally stepped forward again, but the movement lacked its earlier confidence. It was slower, measured, almost cautious. Your Honor, this may indicate an internal pre-processing protocol, he said, searching for language that might contain what had already expanded beyond control. But Alicia responded before the explanation could settle, her voice calm, steady, cutting through the attempt without force. Pre-processing does not assign authorization before case entry, she said. And once again, the simplicity of her words made them impossible to ignore. Judge Whitman's eyes lifted to meet hers, and for the first time, there was no distance in that look. No dismissal. Only a direct acknowledgement of the truth she had brought forward. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lower when he spoke. Miss Brooks, are you aware of any precedent for this sequence? The question was no longer testing her. It was seeking clarity within a system that had just revealed its own inconsistency. Alicia did not hesitate, her answer immediate, grounded. No, Your Honor, she said. Because under standard procedure, no action is generated without an existing case record. She paused briefly, allowing the structure of that statement to settle. Anything generated before that is outside the expected process. The courtroom absorbed her words in silence, not the uncertain silence from before, but one filled with understanding, because the implications were now clear, not just to the judge, but to everyone present. The prosecutor's posture stiffened slightly, his gaze lowering as if recognizing that the argument he had prepared no longer applied. Alicia remained composed, her presence steady, not elevated, not dramatic, but grounded in the consistency of the facts she had presented. Judge Whitman exhaled slowly, his eyes moving once more across the documents, then to the clerk, then back to Alicia, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that extended beyond the case itself. The court recognizes that the sequence of events presented here does not align with established procedure, he said, each word deliberate, precise, and that this discrepancy has been confirmed by internal system records. The acknowledgement settled into the room with a quiet finality, because it marked a point that could not be reversed. The foundation of the case had been examined and found inconsistent, and there was no immediate way to restore it to its original form. Alicia did not react outwardly. She did not nod. She did not speak. She simply stood there, allowing the truth to exist without embellishment. And in that stillness, something became clear to everyone watching. The power in that room had not been taken. It had been redefined, not through force, not through volume, but through clarity, through patience, through a single sequence of facts that no one had expected her to bring. And as Judge Whitman rested his hand flat against the bench once more, the silence that followed was no longer about what would happen next. It was about understanding that whatever did happen next would be different from anything that had been planned when the hearing began. The courtroom did not erupt after the judge's acknowledgement. It did something far more powerful. It remained still, completely still, as if every person present understood that they were standing at the edge of something that could not be undone. Judge Harold Whitman sat upright now, no longer leaning, no longer adjusting, his posture firm but different, not the rigid control of authority, but the deliberate steadiness of someone choosing each action with care. His eyes moved once more across the documents, then to the clerk, and finally back to Alicia Brooks. And in that final glance there was no trace of the earlier dismissal, only recognition, not just of her, but of what she had revealed. The prosecutor did not speak, not immediately, his usual readiness replaced by a measured silence, as if he understood that anything said too quickly might only deepen what had already been exposed. The judge's voice broke the stillness, low, controlled, carrying clearly across the room. The court will suspend the current proceeding pending a formal review of the procedural sequence identified here. The words were precise, but their impact was immediate. The case that had once been treated as routine was now officially paused, not dismissed, not resolved, but held in place because its foundation could no longer be trusted. A subtle shift moved through the observers. Not noise, not reaction, but awareness. The kind that spreads quietly when people realize they have witnessed something rare. Alicia remained still, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her expression unchanged, but the space around her had transformed, no longer defined by assumption, but by respect, earned not through status, but through clarity. The judge continued, his tone steady. The internal system records will be examined in full, and any inconsistency with established procedure will be addressed accordingly. He paused briefly, the silence stretching just enough to emphasize what came next. Until that review is complete, no ruling will be issued on this matter. The statement settled into the room with quiet finality, because it marked a turning point. The case was no longer moving forward under its original path. It had been redirected, not by argument, but by truth. The prosecutor lowered his gaze slightly, his shoulders no longer squared with certainty, but held in a more neutral stance, as if recalibrating within a reality that no longer supported his earlier position. The clerk continued to type, recording each word, each decision, ensuring that this moment would exist not just in memory, but in the official record itself. Alicia finally moved, just a small shift, stepping back from the table, not in retreat, but in completion, as if she understood that her role in this moment had reached its purpose. She did not look toward the audience. She did not acknowledge the room. Her focus remained forward, steady, grounded. The judge's hand rested once more against the bench, not to strike the gavel, but to hold the moment in place. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that extended beyond the case, beyond the room. The integrity of this court depends on the consistency of its process, he said, each word deliberate, measured, and that consistency must be upheld without exception. The message was clear, not directed at Alicia, not directed at the prosecutor, but at the system itself. And as the silence that followed settled into every corner of the courtroom, it became clear that what had happened here was not just a pause in a single case. It was a moment of recognition, a moment where something usually unseen had been brought into the light, and once seen, it could never return to being ignored. No one moved to leave even after the judge's words settled into the official record, because something in the room had shifted beyond procedure, beyond routine, into a space where people were no longer just observing a case. They were witnessing a moment that would follow them long after they stepped outside those doors. Alicia Brooks remained near the table, not standing in defense anymore, but not leaving either, her presence calm, grounded, as if she understood that what had happened was not finished, only revealed. Judge Harold Whitman looked down at the documents one final time before closing the folder slowly, deliberately, the sound soft but final, a quiet acknowledgement that what lay inside those pages could not simply be filed away and forgotten. His gaze lifted across the courtroom, not scanning, not commanding, but measuring, as if he were seeing the room differently now, not as a place of automatic order, but as a space that required vigilance. The prosecutor remained silent, his earlier attempts to redirect the case now replaced by stillness, his posture no longer rigid with certainty, but balanced, cautious, aware that the framework he had relied on had shifted beneath him. The clerk's typing slowed, then stopped, the final keystroke marking the end of the official record for the moment, but not the end of what had been set in motion. Alicia took a small step back, the movement subtle, controlled, not signaling retreat, but completion, as if she had placed something into the system that no longer required her to hold it. The judge spoke again, his voice steady, carrying across the room with a different kind of authority, one built not on assumption, but on acknowledgement. This court will initiate a full procedural audit of the case handling system involved, he said, each word deliberate, chosen with care, and any irregularities identified will be addressed in accordance with judicial standards. The statement was formal, structured, but beneath it was something deeper, something that could not be written into the record: recognition, responsibility, the understanding that what had been uncovered was not isolated, not accidental, but something that demanded attention beyond a single hearing. A quiet shift moved through the observers, not sound, not reaction, but awareness. The kind that settles into people when they realize they have seen something that changes how they understand the system itself. Alicia did not react outwardly. She did not speak. She simply stood there for a moment longer, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged. And in that stillness there was a quiet dignity, not performed, not declared, but evident, the kind that does not need validation because it is rooted in truth. Judge Whitman rested his hand against the bench once more, but this time it was not a gesture of control. It was a pause, a moment of stillness before what would come next. And when he finally reached for the gavel, the movement was slower than before, more deliberate, as if even that simple action now carried weight. He brought it down once, the sound echoing through the courtroom, not as a command, but as a marker, a boundary between what had been assumed and what had now been revealed. "This session is adjourned," he said, and the words carried a finality that extended beyond the case itself, because as people began to rise, quietly, without the usual chatter, it was clear that something had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would remain, in the way they thought, in the way they questioned, in the way they would never again assume that the system could not be challenged by someone they had once overlooked. The courtroom emptied quietly, not with the usual shuffle of relief or casual conversation, but with a measured silence that lingered even as the doors opened and closed, one after another. Alicia Brooks remained where she was for a moment longer, standing beside the table that had once felt like a place of judgment, and now felt like something entirely different, something she had reshaped without raising her voice, without demanding attention, simply by refusing to let what she saw remain unspoken. The documents were still there, neatly aligned, untouched since the gavel struck, as if they carried a weight no one wanted to disturb too quickly. Alicia reached forward slowly and gathered them, her movements as precise as they had been from the beginning, each page placed back into the folder with care, not as evidence anymore, but as something completed, something that had served its purpose. Across the room, Judge Harold Whitman remained seated longer than expected, his gaze no longer fixed on the bench, but lowered slightly, as if tracing the path of what had just unfolded. The authority he carried had not disappeared, but it had changed, tempered by something quieter, something more aware, the kind of awareness that does not announce itself but remains, shaping decisions long after the moment has passed. The prosecutor stepped away without speaking, his earlier certainty replaced by a silence that suggested reflection rather than defeat, because what had happened was not a loss in the traditional sense. It was a correction, a recalibration of something that had gone unquestioned for too long. Alicia turned toward the exit, her steps steady, unhurried, the same pace she had carried into the courtroom. But the room she walked through was no longer the same. The eyes that followed her now were different, no longer dismissive, no longer amused, but thoughtful, respectful, aware that they had witnessed something that could not be undone. She reached the doors and paused briefly, not to look back, not to seek acknowledgement, but simply to take a breath. The kind that marks the end of something significant and the beginning